appunto su questo ultimo aspetto, su quanto si diceva valutare quanto capitale sociale, appunto tema che era stato evocato anche dai media Vagnoni. Professor Putnam, mi riallaccio un po' al tema di internet. Abbiamo visto da questi due contributi di media Vagnoni e Marco Berlinguer, in un caso internet, tecnologia abilitante utilizzata per aumentare il capitale sociale, nel caso concreto dalla regione Emilia-Romagna, per scambiare informazioni e creare contatto con i cittadini. Dall'altra parte Marco Berlinguer ci racconta un mondo che è ovviamente presente sotto gli occhi di tutti, la incapacità da parte delle pubbliche amministrazioni e dei governi in generale di riconoscere il capitale sociale e la produzione collettiva, quindi internet quando interviene nel produrre collettivamente innovazione, intelligenza, forme di conoscenza, non viene riconosciuto e quasi ostacolato. Quindi cosa devono fare le pubbliche amministrazioni? Fare quel passaggio in più in cui internet viene utilizzata come strumento non solo come informazione per scambiare informazioni, ma anche per produrre e quindi creare appunto questa connessione di capitale sociale pieno e riconoscendo quello che sta avvenendo nella società.
I will try to answer that. I will try to answer the last question about what are the practical implications for regional officials. But I want to reflect just briefly on both of these two contributions, valuable contributions. And then I want to pose a question to each, a separate question to each of the two speakers. It's wonderful to learn about the commitment of the region, this region, to more effective creation of data and diffusion or making accessible these data that you've described. Magari se avessimo avuto nel nostro ricerca questo flood of data that is described here. So it's one. I'm a data person, as my colleague Rafi will confirm. So it's wonderful. But I wonder if it's social capital, and this is the question that I want to pose. And it's fruit of some of the conceptual developments in the field of social capital after our original book 20 years ago. Because your description focused very heavily on the networks within l'ente regionale and between l'ente regionale, l'istituzione, and I cittadini. And that is certain, those are certainly networks. But in the years after the publication of our book, other scholars began to distinguish between networks among citizens and networks between citizens and institutions. Both are important, but they're not the same thing. And the kind of social capital, the kind of social networks that were originally emphasized in our work was not the ties or networks between the institutions and individuals, but rather the ties among individuals, part of the social context within civil society, not between civil society and the region. And without denying the importance of these greater attention to ties between the region or the institution and the public, I don't think we should assume that that necessarily helps, or maybe even, I don't think we should assume it prevents the decline of social capital at the level of società civile. And why do I say that? I know that sounds like a very academic comment, but in fact, if we are right, if our research was right, of course we could be wrong, but if we were right, the ultimate source of the power of the institutions in the parts of Italy that had high social capital was not the institutions themselves, but rather these historical ties of social capital at the level of citizens. Not how does the citizen in Piazza Maggiore feel about or contact the regional government, but the ties among the citizens in Piazza Maggiore. Non so se mi spiego. And it's easier for the regional ente to make progress in extending its apparent or nominal ties to the citizens. It's harder for regional officials to create ties dal basso to the regional government. And it's even harder for the regional government to create the kinds of ties in civil society, the norms of honesty and the norms of fiducia among the citizens. And so while I don't at all dismiss them, on the contrary, as a researcher, I'm delighted to hear about the progress that's been made in data, but I don't think we should delude ourselves that that's the same thing as reinforcing what I believe to be the fundamental social resource in the broader society. I was completely fascinated by your account, Marco, of the new mode of production, as exemplified by open source software. And I completely agree with your criticism of the reaction of many institutions and laws that impede, that hinder these new forms of production. Of course, they're not entirely new, as we know in this region, because cooperative forms of production, I mean, le cooperative ci sono state qui ancora prima dell'internet, and they were, in fact, maybe still are, I don't know the current status of cooperatives in Emilia-Romagna, but those were forms of social connection that contributed to production. But it's important to understand what I believe to have been an important prerequisite for the effectiveness of those forms of production, namely a high level of social capital outside the productive arena, outside the realm of production itself. If you ask why have cooperatives, either in the form of agricultural cooperatives or in the form of internet cooperatives, why have they not taken over the world? The answer is we know that there are risks of defection. That is, there's risks. It's not easy to cooperate with someone if you don't have a legal contract and don't have legal relations with the other person. Because suppose, I contribute my little bit of code, and somebody else uses it to make a profit, and where does that leave me? And that creates a disincentive for me to cooperate. Cooperatives in Italy, I believe, and certainly cooperatives in the realm of the internet, have in fact silently depended upon the fact that people who are in those cooperatives could trust one another. And could trust one another not just because of the productive process, but because they shared many values already. And the values of the original creators of the internet, or at least some of the original creators of the internet, and especially those involved in the open source movement, were formed in a very communitarian environment, especially in MIT and among academics. And there were lots of ties, non-productive, not ties that were linked to the process of production, but there were personal ties among those people that allowed them to cooperate and trust one another. The model of the internet that emerged on the west coast of the United States, which is in fact the more dominant part of the process, was a much more individualistic, market-oriented approach to production because they had less pre-existing social capital because the culture and the social structure of Silicon Valley is a much more individualistic, entrepreneurial, less collective environment than the environment on the East Coast, around MIT and to some extent Harvard. I recognize that this may be sounding also like an academic point, but what I really think we need to understand. If we want to extend the productive range of these new forms of cooperation, like open source, we need to ask, what were the sociological prerequisites for forming cooperatives that enabled them to exist? Exactly the same reason you could ask about, well, what is it historically about the soil in this region? I don't mean the physical soil, I mean the sociological soil, that enabled cooperatives to, that is, agricultural cooperatives, to flourish here and not in other parts of the world. I hope that doesn't sound too academic, a comment on what is an extremely interesting new development. Thank you.
Non so se Emilia e Marco vogliono rispondere. Emilia, vuoi